everyone doing? Thank you so much, Jake, for your participation. I love it. So good. Well, y'all, I missed you so much last week. I was at the beach getting tan, but I'm so glad to be back with all of you. Who's ready for tonight, though, after the message? What are we doing after the message tonight? Y'all know? Yeah, it's a board and card game night. So much fun. Who here is like, raise your hand if you prefer a board game. And it's okay. It's okay to be wrong. Yeah, and then raise your hand if you prefer a card game. Okay, so a lot of people did not raise their hand. Raise your hand if you're like not a game person? Question mark? Wow. Interesting. Okay, well, just here for the fun or for the plot? Is that what you said? Okay, I can't hear you. Okay, well, my favorite card game is Phase 10. If we've ever played before, I would like to apologize because I don't know what I've done or said whenever I'm in the heat of the moment. I'm actually going to be vulnerable with you guys tonight, though, and share a little story about myself and one other person in the room, whose name is Ashley Andrews, we are both competitive when it comes to only Phase 10. I really don't care about things outside of that. Ashley is competitive as a person, and we love that about her. But I don't know, like 6 months ago or something, Ashley and I and like a few other people, we were playing Phase 10, and it was pretty late. It was like, what time was it? Like 10:30 or something. It was like 11:30. And one thing about me that most of y'all might not know is I love to go to bed super early. My ideal situation is like being in bed by like 8 o'clock, like before the sun has even gone down, and I enjoy it because then I can read without having to turn on a light, and I really just love turning in early. But this one night, we were at our friend's house, and it was a late night. It was like 11:30 on a school night, on a work day, and we were playing Phase 10, and it did not seem like it was going to ever be over. Like it was like a game that was like never ending, right? And so me and Ashley are sitting next to each other, and she's like, I need this game to end. I've got to go home. I'm like, honestly, same. Tell me what cards you need, and I will lay them down so that, you can win and we can end this thing. So we, make an alliance. It was just a verbal agreement. There was nothing written or anything, which is important for later on. But we made in this alliance. And then what happens was when it was my turn, I had to draw a card to like start my turn, and then I lay one down. And so I was supposed to, lay down a card that Ashley needed that I had. But then what happened, you guys, and this is like such a classic dilemma that I'm sure we can all relate to. I drew a card, and I realized that this was an exact card I needed to move on to Phase 10 and possibly, in a true like underdog moment, maybe even win the game. And so I have this moment where I'm like, I told Ashley I would lay down a card so that we could, she could win and we could go home because it was late. But also I'm like, how fun would it be if I won the game? And so after like really hard 2 seconds of debating this, I laid down my cards, went out on the round, and moved on to Phase 10. And there was an uproar from someone in the room, and it was Ashley. I already told her I was telling this story. But I was like, you know what? This just doesn't happen often that I would win this game. And so then, a quick 30 minutes later, we ended the round. I won Phase 10 that night. Thank you. And me and Ashley have, worked through our differences since then, stronger than ever in our friendship, I would say. But, whenever you're playing a card game or Phase 10 specifically, you get dealt whatever card you get dealt, and ideally, you can play the phase that you're in and go out. Or sometimes, maybe you have like a vendetta against someone who's also playing the game, and you're really targeting them with your skips, or, whatever may happen, which we might see later tonight during the card game portion, or board game if you want to play a board game. But you get, dealt the cards that you're dealt, and sometimes it's not ideal. Sometimes it's really great. and you're able to lay all your phases out, and you're able to go out on the first round, not get any points, whatever it is. But then other times you really struggle to get out of your phase, or someone who you once trusted, betrays you in your alliance, and then, they apologize later, I'm sure. But anyway, so that is what happens a lot of times whenever you're playing cards. Like, you just got to play with the card you're dealt. And that also translates to our lives. Like, sometimes you just have to play with the card you're dealt, and sometimes you just aren't dealt the best cards. You don't have the best cards. And so I was thinking about this because obviously we're playing card games and stuff tonight, but also because when I think about Moses, who's the person that we've been studying for the past few weeks, I don't think Moses really liked the cards that he had been dealt with in his life. I think about it a lot, honestly. I was thinking about his life. He was born, he's an Israelite, and he was born at a time when all Israelite boys, 2 years old and younger, were being murdered. They were not allowed to live. He was also sent down the Nile River in a boat, or not in a boat, in a basket that at any time could have toppled over, and he could have been he could have drowned in the Nile River. He was then raised by the people who were oppressing and enslaving his family and other Israelites. We then see that he, commits murder, and then he runs away, and he is on the run, a runaway for 40 years, working for his father-in-law, really having nothing to show for his life. We just see that he does not get dealt the best set of cards. And now, where we're catching up in the story, he is standing before a burning bush, right? He was just trying to live his life, have a normal day. But then a burning bush called to him. It was the Lord who was speaking through a burning bush. And he's in front of this burning bush, and God is telling him, you have to go back to Egypt. And he did not want to go. It's so obvious that he did not want to go. He did not think he was equipped. He had a million excuses, which is what we're studying through this summer. He did not like the cards that he had been dealt. And we see that in all these excuses that he gives the Lord whenever he's given this massive calling on his life. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at the text. We're going to be in Exodus 4, 1 through 9. And we're also going to review a little bit where we've been because we're on our third excuse tonight. So first, our big idea of the series, and this is going to be, I believe this is a fill-in on your note guide, that God is bigger than our excuses. God is bigger than my excuses. Sorry about that. And that's our big idea of the series. And then I'm going to go ahead and start reading this text. Again, it's Exodus 4, 1 through 9. If you have a Bible, that's great. If not, it's going to be on the screen. What I would like is there are going to be some words, some phrases that are in red. Whenever we get to the red phrases, I would love for you to read those with me, just so we can kind of interact a little bit with the Word of God. So after we have written that down, God is bigger than my excuses, I'm going to start reading. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. And I will start, if it's from red, would love for you to read it with me. Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Then the Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" "A staff," he replied. The Lord said, "Throw it on the ground." Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake and turned it back into his staff in his hand. "This," said the Lord, "is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So Moses put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out and the skin was leprous, it had become white as snow. "Now put it back into your cloak," he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored, like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, "If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground." So that's our text that we're going to be in tonight, and we see our third excuse. So let's review a little bit. I think I have a list of the first two excuses. So week 1, Moses' excuse was, "I'm not enough." God has called him to go back to to go back to Egypt to tell the Israelite people to lead them out of slavery, right? The first excuse is, I am not enough. And the second excuse that Preston taught about last week is, I don't know enough. Okay, and then the third excuse, the one we're tackling tonight that we just read, is that they won't believe me. So this is Moses' a third excuse. You can go ahead and write that down. So whenever I was thinking about this, I was trying to get my head into, like, Moses' headspace, trying to, like, think through, like, maybe what he would have been thinking, what he would have been feeling. And I was really trying to identify, like, what his main emotion would be, because often whenever we read the Bible, I think sometimes we forget that these were people. Like, these were people with real emotions and real nerves and real, like, fears. And so I'm kind of stuck between the two on this one. And I wonder if this excuse was motivated by two key emotions. And the first one I was thinking of, maybe it's pride. Like, they won't believe me. I think of Moses. He was raised with these people, and he's being asked to go back to where he came from. And he did not leave under the best circumstances. He kind of ran away. He fled the scene. And so now he's, like, having to, like, kind of get his life together and go back to the place that he had once abandoned. He's having to go back to a group of people who knew him whenever he was raised, knew him as a kid, knew that he had made all these different mistakes, and he's kind of been missing in action, right? And the last time he saw any of them, he had just murdered someone. So he's not really, like, going to receive a warm homecoming anyway. And I wonder if that was one of his, like, emotions, like, oh, I can't believe I have to humble myself to kind of go back to these people that I've outgrown. So maybe it was pride. Another emotion I was thinking through is maybe it was fear. Like, another thing that I think is very valid, I wonder if Moses was fearful of him going back and then him being enslaved as well. I'm wondering if he was fearful that they were going to hold the fact that he had murdered an Egyptian 40 years before against them. I wonder if he was fearful of the fact that he was going back to Egypt to tell them that the one true God had sent him there. And why I think that might have been a fearful experience is because Egypt was a polytheistic society. Everyone say polytheistic. So good. Polytheistic, that means that they believed in a lot of different gods and goddesses, false gods and false goddesses. And they would not have any concept of believing in a one true God because they believed in many, many gods and goddesses. And so I wonder if he was also fearful of the fact that they weren't going to believe him because they didn't even have the context to understand that there was a one true God. Like, what if they don't believe me? What if they hold me accountable for this murder? What if they enslave me too? But we don't know. We don't know what his main emotion is, but we do know this. It's so clear that he did not want to go. It's so incredibly clear he did not want to be the one who God called to go back to Egypt. And God had already proved his power and his might, but there was still this voice inside of Moses' head that was causing him to doubt that God was who he said he was and that he would do what he said he would do. And I think that's what led to this excuse. They won't believe me. And I don't know about you guys, but anytime I ask a question, if anyone ever responds to my question with another question, that really gets on my nerve. That is something that I actually hate. And I think what's so interesting here, and honestly so funny, is that is what God does. He literally responds to, I am still here. What do I do? Dylan? Okay. Not me just touching the screen. I'm sure that did absolutely nothing. Well, I don't know where the buttons are, you guys. I feel like Vanna White. Oh, am I wrong? Okay, so it's all good because where there's a will, there's a way. Because the will is fixing that. Love it. Let's give it up for Will for fixing the TV in such a moment of chaos. I love that camaraderie, you guys. Okay, so back to what I was saying. Who else here gets a little irritated whenever they ask a question and they're hit back with another question? Does anyone? Okay, yeah. I mean, I would think everyone. If not, that's so cool, and I love that y'all have that patience within you. But that is exactly what God does. That's his response as he asks this question, and he says, "What is that in your hand?" And so Moses replies, a staff. He had a staff in his hand. And this is so cool because that is the same tool that Moses had used for 40 years as a shepherd. And so I think it would be so valid for Moses to view those 40 years that he spent as a shepherd as a waste or as a shameful time. Like, he was once a prince. He was raised with the prince of Egypt, and then he runs away and he becomes a shepherd. But I think what God is showing us is very, very important, and it's this, that God can use your past for his glory. God likes, that's the next slide. I think we have it coming up. God can use your past for his glory. He was showing Moses, I'm going to use this tool that you've used for the past 40 years, and I'm going to use it for my glory. God likes to use what's already in our hands, the tools that we already have. And so I want to ask you guys tonight to think about this. What is already in your hand? Maybe I know we have a lot of girls who play volleyball. Maybe it's a volleyball. Maybe God has placed you on a volleyball team so that you can show your teammates the love of God. We also have a lot of people in here who are very talented musically. Maybe there's a musical instrument in your hand that you can play in the band or the worship band or in a band that travels around, and you can bring glory to God that way. Or I know almost all of us have this in our hand, a phone. Maybe you don't have one right now, but you might. Is it a phone? How can you use a phone to bring God glory? How can you use a phone to build up the people on the other side of that screen? We all have things that are in our hands. We all have different talents and different past and different things. And God is showing us, I think, through this, that Moses' past did not disqualify him from God's plan. In fact, God had redeemed Moses' past. And we see that through this staff. We see God's power again as he turns the staff into a snake. I think it's absolutely hilarious to think of this snake, like he throws it on the ground, the staff, it turns into a snake, and it literally is like Moses ran away as quickly as possible. But then the next verse is God says, reach out and grab it by the tail. You know what? I would never grab a snake at all, but definitely not by the tail. Oh, Carly has. I love that. That's so brave of you. Okay, please. So he reaches out. He's running in one verse, and then in the next verse, he's reaching out to grab the snake by the most dangerous part of this. Like the tail is where you would get stung or whatever happens. I don't really know. But what do you... Bit by the tail? No. You guys, I'll research this, and I will maybe come back to it. I probably won't. But what I know is you shouldn't grab a snake by a tail. And so I'm moving on. But we see a glimpse of Moses' faith in the Lord by the fact that he does this without hesitation. And as soon as he does, the Lord changes it back into a staff. That is literally so cool. We see Moses' faith, and we see his obedience to do what God told him to do, even in the midst of him being afraid. We see this next response of the Lord in verses 6 and 7. I'm going to read these for us real quick. Then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. Now put it back into your cloak, he said. So Moses put his hand back into the cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. So a quick little, medical lesson. I'm really giving out a lot of advice that I don't know anything about. I'm really going for it tonight. But, I Googled this, and leprosy is a disease, and it causes skin damage, nerve damage, and in biblical times, leprosy was not something that could be healed. There was not medicine for it yet. And so what would happen if someone had leprosy, they would be contagious, and so they would often be kicked out of society, outcast, and live in these communities of people who also had leprosy, and they would be outcast, right? They would be considered unclean by the people of the time. They would have to leave their friends and their families and go live in these communities. And we see this a lot in the Bible. We see it a lot in the Old Testament, and we also see it a lot in the New Testament. And when we see it in the New Testament, it's so incredible because it's often Jesus who is healing these people and performing miracles. But I think what God is showing us here by causing Moses to first have leprosy and then immediately healing it, I think he's showing us two things. And the first one is this. I think he's showing us his power over Moses, and then also by extension, his power over Moses' enemies, because God is all powerful. I want everyone to repeat this word, omnipotent. God is omnipotent, which means he is all powerful. One of the most beautiful names of God is El Shaddai, and that means that God is almighty, that he is all powerful. And we see his power in this transformational work that he does in Moses. The second thing that I think this is showing us is that God can bring healing and wholeness to our brokenness. To have leprosy in this time would to be unclean, to be seen as unclean in the eyes of the world. But God makes us clean. So this is our second fill-in, that God can bring wholeness to our brokenness. God can bring wholeness to our brokenness, which is just so good. I'm going to start reading the next thing, but we can leave this up for a little bit. Then the Lord said, and this is the third response. Okay, so he gives these two signs to Moses, and then he says this afterwards. If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. I also had to Google this, so I'm just going to be transparent. Actually, Preston Googled this for me. So Egypt is largely a desert, but the Nile River runs all the way through it, runs through most of Africa. And the Nile provided a vital source of fresh water to Egypt. Drinking water, water to wash things with, water to, water crops and plants. And without the Nile, life in Egypt, especially in this time, would not have been possible. It was the lifeline of Egypt. And so the Nile made a way for transportation, for people to get up the river, to send crops, to send goods, whatever it was. And the Nile also, this is so interesting, would flood a couple times a year. And when it flooded, it would deposit nutrients into the crops that would make them grow even stronger. It would produce even more crops. So the Nile is integral to Egypt. It's very, very important, especially during this time, but today it's still very important. And so verses 8 and 9, God is saying, he's kind of giving a promise. He's saying that if they do not listen to you the first time, if they don't listen to you the second time, I'm going to send another sign. But this sign will come as a judgment to the people of Egypt. If the Pharaoh does not listen to you, there will be a judgment that will occur. And this judgment would affect everyone across Egypt, not just the Pharaoh. He was going to go after the water of the Nile. And so I think whenever we're in the Old Testament, there are some things that are just kind of hard to grapple with. There are some parts of the Bible that are really, really hard for us to understand. But what I want us to see in this is a promise that the Lord also gives his people. And it's this, and I'm going to break this down a little bit. This is our third fill-in, that God is providential with his people, including you and me. And I'm going to break that down a little bit. Providential means that the Lord goes ahead of us in the future, and he provides for the needs that he knows that one day we will have. He provides for his people, and he is providential in Moses' life in this moment, saying, listen, if they don't listen to you the first time, if they do not listen to you the second time, I've already prepared the next sign. I've got it covered. That's what he's saying in this moment, because this means that he is going to be in the future providing these things. God is letting Moses know, I've got you covered. I'm going to send more signs to the people of Egypt if they do not let me know. And we see that God can perform these mighty works of transformation to get his point across. And we are reminded that he will accomplish what he will want, what is his will to accomplish. Our God is very, very big. That is what he does. And I'm going to give you another spoiler. A few weeks ago when I taught, I also gave a spoiler because this is just such a good passage. I just could spend the rest of my life reading Exodus. We just see so much goodness about who God is, and we are revealed so much about who his character is. But another spoiler is Moses does go to Egypt, and he does talk to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh does not let the Israelites go. He doesn't. The text says that his heart is hardened, and he does not let them go. And as a result for that, as a punishment for that, as a judgment, the Lord sends 10 plagues to Egypt, 10 signs from the Lord. And the first one is that he turns the Nile River into blood, the whole thing. That's the first plague. And I say that to say that God is going to accomplish his plan. His plan was for the Israelite people to be free. And he was going to do whatever it took to get his people to become free. And so, as heavy as that can be, whenever we're thinking about it in this Old Testament context, I also want us to see the joy and the hope that should give us as the people of God. If you have surrendered your life to the Lord, you are God's people. If you are walking in a new life with Jesus Christ, he calls you yours. And that's why I love this point. God's providential with his people, including you. He is in the future preparing things that you're going to need that you don't even know about yet. He has that in mind already because he cares deeply for us, and he invites us to be part of his plan. Not because he needs us, not because he needs our power, not because he needs our voice, but because he desires for us to be a part of it with him. He wants us to use our past for his glory. He wants to redeem those things that you think about and cringe about. Like, he wants to redeem that. He wants to use your talents and your gifts to give himself glory. He wants to see you use your talents and gifts to love his people well, to love others well. And I think there's a lot of us in this room, and if we're being honest, when we look at our lives, maybe we look at the past, maybe we're looking at right now, we're kind of bummed about the cards that we've been dealt, if you will. And we really wish that, the phase would end so that you could get a fresh stack. We want a redeal. And I think what's important, and what I want us to do tonight, as we kind of close, we're going to have a time of response, is I want us to think about what is holding us back from letting God use the cards that are in our hands. Whenever God looks at us and says, what's in your hand, what is it that we can use to bring him glory? And there's so much freedom in giving him, in turning those things back over to the Lord. Again, he doesn't need us to do that, but he invites us to do it. And that's so incredible. We have a God who can perform these amazing miracles. He can make someone have leprosy and then heal it in the next moment. He can, turn a staff into a snake. He can do all these great big things. He can split a sea for an entire people group to walk through it. And he wants to move in our lives, and that should be a really, really, really incredible thing to think about. That should boggle our minds. That is so, so, so good. God wants to be present in our lives. He wants to work through whatever it is that we've been through in our past. He wants to redeem those things, and he invites us to be part of this big story that he's creating. And so I want you guys to think about this tonight. We're going to have a song, a time of response, but I want to think about what's in your hand. We're going back into school pretty soon. Sorry to break it to you guys. You're going back to school pretty soon. What is it that's in your hands? What is it that, is it that God has placed you where you can bring glory to him, where you can love people well? So I want us to have a moment of reflection, and I'm going to pray for us. Dear God, I thank you